Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have a video talking about the worst books in some of my favorite series. There are many, many fantasy series that I've read, and there are many, many books that I've liked. But in a lot of the fantasy series I've read, there's just been that one book that has just not been up to par with the others. That one book that makes me feel, that's not good, or I might want to stop the series because of this one book. And usually I keep going despite that book, but there's always that one book, and I thought that'd be an interesting thing to talk about, what I think is the weakest book in some series, and I know everyone else will have a different opinion, so let me know what you think is the weakest book in some of your favorite fantasy series. So why don't I, and I'm limiting this to fantasy for right now, I might do Star Wars or Star Trek or science fiction or other things later, but for right now I'm doing fantasy in this. So why don't I go ahead and talk about the first book, which is going to be A Feast for Crows. I think this is this is the fourth, and I think the weakest book in the Song of Ice and Fire series, also more commonly known as the Game of Thrones series. You know, this series started with a Game of Thrones, which I thought was superb, just amazing, fantastic, and then had the second book, A Clash of Kings, which I thought was still pretty good, and it also had something of swords, Storm of Swords, and that was still pretty good. And so I was like, all right, this series, it's going along pretty good. But I'd heard some things about the fourth book, and I heard some people say it was their favorite, and some people say it was their least favorite, and I was interested. Based off the series, the TV show, I was really excited for the material covered in the fourth book. But I went and read this book, and it was by far the weakest in the series. I think that the fifth book was a little bit of a step up. The fifth book was okay. It was still not like the first three books, which I thought were fantastic. But the fifth book was okay, but this fourth book, it was the only book of the series that I actually disliked. And I was like, come on, George, I know you can do better than this. The biggest issue to me here is that he just decides, for some reason, to go on tangents. He's just focusing on stories and plot lines and characters that he doesn't need to focus on. He needs to. This book is evidence of why he cannot finish the series, is because he just wants to keep going off in new directions, and it's just not good for him, I don't think. And so that's why this is, I think, the weakest book in this series. Next, we're moving on to The Rune Lords, which is one of my favorite fantasy series. It's a series that needs to be talked about on BookTube more often. And the book I'm going to talk about is called Sons of the Oak. And this is the fifth book in the Rune Lords series. And for those of you who don't know, the Rune Lords basically is like in two sections. You have the section of the first four books, which are just some of the best fantasy books ever. Then you have the second section of four books, books 5, 6, 7, and 8. And I believe that 6, 7, and 8 are all very well done. They're not as good as the first four, I'll admit, but they're still very well done books. But the first book in that second set, called Sons of the Oak, it really is a bridge novel. I almost consider it to be that you have the first four books, and then this is the bridge novel, and then you have the last three books. And this bridge novel, I just think, totally ruins all the magic of the Rune Lords. It has one of the best opening scenes of any Rune Lords novel. The opening scene here is superb and fantastic, and I was on cloud nine after reading that scene because of how disturbing and awesome it was. And then the rest of the book just goes way downhill, with some characters that it kills, with characters that it just ignores, with where the plot, he's like, I have this huge huge maps that he made in the first couple books, and we only explored a tiny fraction of those maps. Well, rather than explore more of those maps, no, we're just going to go off the map now. And I'm like, but what happened to that awesome map and all this world that I came accustomed to? No, he just wanted to go do new things. And so this feels like, why would you do this? Now, he writes the course in the last three books. It's not the course that I would have wanted him to go with the series, but I think he writes the course in the end. But with this book, he just sends them out there, and I think he had a plan to really go on his own new direction, but I just think it was the wrong move. So I was very disappointed with this book. I think it's an okay read, but not great. The next two books I'm going to talk about together, because depending on how you consider books in this series, you might consider either one of these. But the weakest for the Wheel of Time for me are New Spring and Crossroads of Twilight. If you read Wheel of Time, you know why Crossroads of Twilight is the least favorite. So I don't have to go too much in depth. It didn't advance the plot fast enough. It felt like it was just rehashing things we didn't need to rehash. It did do some cool things with Matt. I did like a few of the things that they did with Matt. But overall, I was like, really, the book before it had some cooler things, and the books after this just superb. And this is like when the slog was at its most interminable, and we were like, okay, come on, Jordan, speed this up. So that's why this is on there. But New Spring it's like a prequel novel, so it's not one of the original 14 that we consider as, but it's still set in the universe, it's still a prequel. And for one, this book follows plot lines that it doesn't need to follow. It doesn't portray Moraine and other Aes Sedai characters in the way that I envisioned them being portrayed, and it doesn't tell the story I really wanted it to tell. I really wanted it to tell the big setup for the overall series, and instead it was more just a Moraine piece. And I thought, yeah, we're going to get this big, this cover is reminiscent of the original cover for the Eye of the World, and I thought, oh, this series is really going to... This book is going to explore the similar themes, kind of how the first King of Shannara explored similar themes as the Sword of Shannara. I thought this would explore the same themes as the Eye of the World, and it just didn't. And I did not enjoy the process of reading this book. I had already read the whole Wheel of Time series. I had read all 14 books before I read this, and I was just super disappointed that this didn't cover anything of what I wanted it to cover, and it just wasn't enjoyable as a read. So I didn't like the characters, didn't like the plot, didn't like anything about it. So that's why these two are my lowest. But if you don't count this because it's a prequel, then that's why this book would be on there. Next, I have one of the book series that I've read the most books from and have been the fan of the longest is the Shannara series. And the book I'm going to talk about is The Legends of Shannara, The Measure of Magic. This was a book that I read in a day. And I was so frustrated with it because Terry Brooks has some fantastic ideas. He has some fantastic world building. He's very much a minimalist in his magic systems. Rather than put too much in the magic system, he'd rather put more into the characters in the world and the plot, which I love. But he went too little on the plot in this book, and he basically made a promise. It is a duology. He basically made a promise in the first book. We're going to be dealing with the bubble, and the enemies are trying to get into the bubble, and we're trying to get out of the bubble. That's the basic premise. And I was like, okay, we're going to go into the unknown. We're going to settle the four lands. None of that happens. We stay in bubble almost all the book, and when we do go out of the bubble, it's not exciting. It's just basically just outside the bubble. And we don't explore the new lands. We don't see them settling the new lands. We don't see the different races truly pop up the way that I thought they would. And a lot of the characters get unsatisfactory endings. And I know that sometimes it's okay to have an unsatisfactory ending because you want to have some tragedy in your books, but this did not give satisfying endings to any of the characters that I liked. And it should have been a trilogy, and he should have taken his more time with it, and he should have really made it delivered on promises. That's the whole thing. Is the whole idea behind novels is you have to do setups and payoffs, promises, payoffs, and he makes promises that he just doesn't keep. There's some authors that do that, and then some great authors make payoffs that you didn't realize were promises at the beginning, but this is not a good example of that at all. Next, talking about the Dresden Files. Now, I haven't read a huge amount of the Dresden Files. With all these other series, I've read all the books in the series, or a high majority of them. With Dresden Files, I've only read the first 5 books, but there is a huge difference between where I think the other books in the series are and where I think this book is, and that would be Full Moon. I read the first Dresden book, Stormfront, and I thought, this is pretty entertaining. Then I read Full Moon and disliked it so much that I spent almost 2 years without picking up another Dresden Files novel. And then I picked up Grave Peril and loved it, and Summer Night, which I liked, and then Death Masks, which I loved. And so I've really been feeling a exuberance about the series, but Full Moon just tanked it for me. I did not like the plot. I felt like he rehashed too much from the first book. I felt like the mystery wasn't as enjoyable. I did not like the promiscuity in this book or the language in this book. I didn't like the character development as well, and so just nothing really about this book worked for me. The best part about this book is the title, because the title's hilarious. But didn't like this book. The last book on my list, I'll talk about in a second, but there are some book series. For instance, I don't have a Cosmere book on here because there's no Cosmere book that I feel like is terrible compared to the others. I think they're all great, just some are much better than others. And then you have books like other book series that like a little trilogy here, or like a duology or tetralogy here, where I'm like, I've only read a couple books, like it's not really fair to put up comparisons when there's that few books in a series. I'm really only doing this for multi-book series. So the next and final book I'll talk about is Streams of Silver, which is the 5th book in the Legend of Drizzt series. I read the first 3 Drizzt books, the Homeland trilogy, and thought it was superb. The first novel, Homeland, boy, did that make me think about life. Oh man, that is a deep book. And you don't realize it's that deep when you're pitching the book. But it is a deep, deep book. And then the second and third books have some depth to them, but not quite as much. And then you have the 4th book, which has virtually little depth, but is one of the most enjoyable, fun rides of a book I've ever read. Then I read Streams of Silver, and I did not like anything about this book. It took too long to do what it needed to do. They rehashed too much. Like I like how Sword of Shannara feels like a retelling of Lord of the Rings. This feels like it's a retelling of the Mines of Moria, except it was not an enjoyable retelling. And I didn't like the way he made changes or the way he made similarities. Just nothing about this was appealing to me. And thankfully, I enjoyed the Halfling's Gem, book 6, which is the last book I read. I enjoyed it okay. I didn't love it. And so I haven't really picked up too much Dresden since then. I mean, Drizzt since then, but I'd be willing to, but I just didn't like where this book was taking the direction, and I felt like, come on, Ari Salvatore, you can do a better job. And this was only his second novel, so I feel like I should give him more opportunity, because it seems like he got better and better when he got to the Homeland trilogy. But I just didn't care for this one. So those are the various worst books in the series that they are in. If you've read any of these series and read these books, do you agree with me that I picked the right book as the worst book in the series, or do you think now this book's even worse? Let me know those thoughts down in the comments section down below. And if you have your own another series that you think, oh, well, this series you didn't mention, but this is the worst book in that series, let me know that too. But until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.